So, hi everyone again. Welcome to GADGA's fourth graduate student colloquium of the fall 2021. So, just a few words on GADGA. GADGA is a graduate student group led by graduate students in Arabic and Islamic studies that organizes different kinds of events for the training of graduate students. As we are still planning for the events of spring semester, so we were just announcing that to announce to call for I don't know, any ideas, or if you would like to present your research, um, please contact us. We are still in the process of organizing the next semester. So today's workshop is entitled Becoming a PhD Candidate, Strategies for the Comprehensive Exam and the Dissertation. So I wish to send a warm welcome to our presenters today, Dr. Annie Gol, Dr. Rosabel Ansari, Ali Jebeji, and Karen McNeil. I will introduce each of them before their talk. We will first start with Dr. Annie Gol, who has to leave at 4 p.m. to make sure that she has the time to present and answer the questions. After she will present us on thesis writing in the Arabic program, we will continue with Dr. Rosabel Ansari, who will present on the same subject in Islamic studies. Then we will continue with Ali Jebeji, who will inform us about strategies for the comprehensive exams. And then Karen McNeil, who will present on project management strategies for graduate students. And then we will address questions and comments. So first, let me introduce to you our first speaker, Dr. Annie Gol. Annie Gol is a cultural historian who studies food and gender in the Arabophone world. She's currently an assistant professor of Arabic studies at the University of Maryland. Her work uses food and kitchens to explore how concepts like nationality, gender, race, and class are made meaningful in everyday contexts. Other interests include the history of women's movements in the Middle East and North Africa, and learning by making. Annie holds a PhD from Georgetown University, Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies. She graduated in 2019 with her PhD dissertation entitled Kitchen Histories in Northern Africa, in which she studied the middle-class kitchen as both a contextual and material space in the 20th century Egyptian and Moroccan context, to explore its role in the formation of modern national cultures, the figure of middle-class housewife, and the concept of domestic happiness. And now I'm passing the microphone to her to hear more about the strategies that were helpful for the successful completion of her thesis. So please join me in welcoming her.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to participate. It's really, it's strange to be back in DC and not have been back to Georgetown physically. So I'm really glad to see some faces that are familiar and see some new faces and share whatever I can that might be helpful. My next appointment isn't until 4:30 and it's also on Zoom. So I have to sort of sign off exactly then, but I can hopefully stick around up to that point to answer questions about anything. So I actually put together, I like lists. I'm a fan of lists. So I put together just like a list of the advice that I would tell to my past self. And I put it in a Google Doc. So I've just dropped the link into the chat. And I figured I would just kind of run through that list. I think somebody just joined, so I'll add the link again. So yeah, I sort of begin the list with something you all might have heard before, but you will probably hear again, which is the best dissertation is a done dissertation, a finished dissertation. This is sort of your first big chance to say something on your topic. It will not be your last, unless you want it to be, which would be fine. But sort of like having that mentality, I think, helps. Like the goal is to get it done. Like it doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be everything you wanted it to be. It just has to be finished, and your advisor has to say, you can defend this. So like that's the goal. The next thing I say is to establish, and I should say also, like any list of advice, like some of it will work for you and some will not. So these are not hard and fast rules. This is advice I would give myself, is how I kind of like to think of it. There's a lot written out there about how academics should have like writing routines and write every day. And I have kind of mixed feelings about it. But I will say the one time I have had sort of a strict writing routine and kept to it was writing the dissertation. And that was really helpful for me. So you can start by figuring out when and where you write the best and just do as much as you can to kind of schedule yourself around that while you're completing the dissertation. And sort of reward yourself for keeping to it. I rewarded myself with lots of like herbal tea and seltzer and like walking my dog and playing with my dog. But also be kind to yourself if you break from the routine. Like that happens. Sometimes you have a job application that comes up or a personal thing happens, because that happens. So like having a routine means you know exactly how to get back into it, which can be useful. Into sort of more thinking about things you can do now that will help you prepare for the defense. I would recommend like try to make it so that your defense is not the first time you're sort of publicly talking about your research and fielding questions about it. So start presenting work in progress for a range of audiences as soon as you start to develop a topic, or even before then, if you have a graduate like seminar paper you wrote that you really like and it would work with a conference, start presenting that. And like this space is a really wonderful, it's great to sort of start with colleagues and people on campus. And my other advice there is to not just, I mean, it's useful to do the big things like MESA or AAR, but also look for small conferences and workshops that are like more in your exact specialty. So some of my most productive experiences have been like little conferences on Middle East food studies, which is very niche. You sort of start to build a community of colleagues and mentors that is really just helpful in the solitary writing phase. A couple of just like very practical things is to, even in coursework and comps, to figure out a note-taking system and figure out some kind of system for managing citations or sources. So for some people that could just be like Google Docs and lists and documents. I really like Evernote. I use Google Docs for Arabic sources when I'm writing stuff in Arabic because it manages Arabic the best. And I swear by Zotero. But everyone's sort of different with this. So like, I would just recommend like get in the habit of using those, even to take notes during coursework and when you're studying for exams, because it's so helpful later to have everything in one place. So I have an article coming out next month that I had to cite a source that I hadn't read about or thought about since comps. And I could go back to Evernote and I had this like beautiful little summary and a quotation that basically went directly into my article. So that's sort of like paying yourself dividends for the future if you start a sort of note-taking practice even before you have a dissertation topic on the sort of major texts and things in your field that you're working on. Another sort of really specific practical bit of advice is to one of my committee members recommended, as I was writing my dissertation, to get this book by William Germano called From Dissertation to Book. And he said, this will feel like absurd. Like, why should I be thinking about the book when I'm just trying to write the dissertation? But it's actually really helpful to read it. And you can just get it from the library and kind of skim through and kind of see it's basically sort of helping you think about what is a dissertation and then what does a publisher want from a book and how are those two things different. So I found it really surprisingly helpful to read when I was still writing the dissertation, because it helped me kind of like set boundaries about sort of what the dissertation could be. And it helped me like let go of some ambitions I had for it. So like the dissertation has an audience of like 4 or 5 people. Like that's the only audience that matters is your committee. Like write it for them and then think about the bigger statement you want to make. And that's something you can do with the book. So I found that like really sort of helpful as like limiting the dissertation to a project that is manageable. As you start preparing for the defense itself, I have a couple of sort of tips about that. A piece of advice I was given that I followed and I found really useful was to sort of go back through your dissertation and anticipate, your committee members by now. You sort of have a sense of like what their criticisms or questions might be. And you get a chance to kind of open the defense with your remarks. Use that space, not just to talk about the dissertation and its argument and its contribution, but also to sort of head off or like start controlling the conversation by acknowledging like things you weren't able to get to, anticipating criticisms and explaining why you did things a particular way. It just sort of like starts things on your terms. A really useful framing device, which I used very frequently in my defense, was to say, that's a great question or that's a great topic. I wasn't able to fit it into the dissertation, or it didn't work out here, or I'm not sure how I'm going to do that, but that will be a priority when I write the book, which like may or may not be true. But it's sort of like a way of sort of thinking about the dissertation as this discrete topic that doesn't have to do everything, even in the context of your defense. Let's see. The hardest part of the defense for me was scheduling it. Professors' schedules are very difficult to coordinate, so just like don't despair. It will happen. Like the department wants you to graduate, and it will eventually happen. I just wish somebody had like told me that regularly while I was trying to actually schedule the thing. Another like super concrete piece of advice about the defense is, as you're planning it, ask a close friend or your partner to plan a celebration for you afterwards. Like you will be too busy, you won't want to, you won't have the time. But when you finish your defense, it's like horribly anticlimactic and you have a lot of feelings and it's very strange. That was my experience. It's been some of my friends' experiences. And it's really nice to just automatically know someone is going to like gather some people around you to like say, no, like you did an amazing thing and we're going to celebrate it. And I've like participated in those that are just like a toast on Zoom where like people from all over the world gather. Or it can be sort of an in-person thing or a small dinner, but like sort of like delegate that, have someone do that for you. Number 9 is just repetition of the best dissertation is a done dissertation. It's like important enough to put twice on the list. So just say that to yourself often, maybe like put it on a sticky note on your computer. Have a friend whose job it is to just like tell you that multiple times, because it's just like, for a lot of us, it's the biggest project we've ever done. And it's so easy to like get lost in the weeds of it and lose sight of the fact that like the goal is just to finish. And then the very last sort of bit of advice I have is to just be really kind to yourself. It is not a kind process, but you're more than your dissertation, you're more than your research. Struggling or having hard patches as you do it is not a reflection on you, is not a reflection on your scholarship. And I say this because I have to say it to myself still. So be kind to yourself and acknowledge that it's not always easy to be kind to yourself. Like I think we're often our worst critics. As a part of being kind to yourself, I would say you just have to prioritize building community. So colleagues at Georgetown, like people in spaces like this, but also other people in your field, people outside of academia. Just make sure there are people who can be kind to you and help you be kind to yourself, even when that's really, really difficult. Because it can be brutal and exhausting and lonely and all-consuming. So having people who can like help you maintain that perspective is really, really important. So yeah, that's a whirlwind through my my list of things I wish I'd known, and I'm happy to take questions towards the end.
Thank you very much, Annie. That was really helpful to hear about your personal experience. Now we will hear Ali Jebeji. Let me introduce him. So he's a PhD candidate majoring in Islamic studies. He's interested in the formative period of the Islamic intellectual sciences. In particular, he studies the development of the Hadith sciences and the role various types of Hadith played in the growth of Islamic theology, jurisprudence, and historiography. Additionally, he is interested in the history and historiography of early Islam, and in particular, the portrayal of the companions in classical Sunni historiography. So now he will share with us his COMPS experience and strategies for its successful completion. Please join me in welcoming him. Ali, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you, Hatice, for the introduction, and thank you, Hatice Mariz, for organizing this. And thank you to the other presenters for the tips that we've received and are going to receive with Karen as well. So I'm going to just share my screen. All right, so let's get started. So I divided kind of how I wanted to give advice on the comps into 4 sections, 4 key steps. As you can see here, so step 1, you're selecting fields and you're selecting committee members, your readers. Step 2, you're populating the reading list for the fields that you've selected. Step 3 is the kind of big one, you're doing your readings. And then step 4 is you're reviewing for and taking the exam. So let's get right into it. Okay, so for when you're selecting your fields and your readers, I would recommend having it's kind of the first time you're really given open freedom in your graduate experience. Before then, you're just taking courses and regurgitating kind of papers related to that course. But now you get to pick. So it can be a daunting moment. I would recommend focusing 2 of those fields directly on what dissertation topic you're planning. And don't make them exactly the same. You know, have them approach the dissertation topic from maybe 2 opposite directions, from 2 different dimensions. But make sure something is related to the dissertation there. And then keep the 3rd field as a kind of wild card. I didn't do this. I kind of did all 3 on the same period, just from different dimensions. And I regret that a little bit. I think one of them could have been something related to, for instance, computer science or digital humanities or something like that. Some kind of external field that you're not going to get exposed to except if you force it yourself. And on the whole, you're trying to balance between keeping something narrow and specific, because you do want to be an expert. You know, in this age of hyper specialization, you can't be a master of everything. It has to be specific. But you also want to be broad and comprehensive, right? It's called the comps for a reason. So it's about striking the balance between those 2. Now, an important thing that I mentioned already is knowing your dissertation topic. So the comps are meant to prepare you for that, so that as soon as you pass your exams, you can hit the ground running for your dissertation research. And hopefully you'll have set a groundwork, you know, and you'll know the readings that you've done and that you have to do. The problem is, though, that most of us, or many of us, probably won't know our dissertation topic. So if you can just guess the general trajectory, the context, or the approach that you're going to take, some kind of probabilistic skill that will be useful, try and match it to that. Like, this is really not about experimenting anymore. If there ever was an experimenting phase, it's over. It's over by now. And you just have to be preparing for your dissertation in a very kind of pragmatic way. Now, once you know your fields, you also have to select readers. It's kind of a process happening simultaneously. You have to know which readers will be available for which fields. I'd recommend getting the advice of students who've done this before, and they can tell you kind of which readers are okay with which topics and how each reader functions, and kind of the expectations you can have of them. Consider making the 3rd reader, again, as that wild card outside of the department. I didn't do this, and again, I regret not doing that. I think you can be a lot more well-rounded if you have someone outside of the department, because you've already been taking coursework with these people over and over again. It will increase your exposure if you kind of leave the department for that 3rd reader. But the kind of most important thing to remember with the committee members is no one is going to do the work for you. Don't have keep your expectations limited from what they're going to do, right? They're going to make an exam question and they're going to be there on exam day, and you know, don't expect too much from them. Not that like that's how things should be, but that's how things are probably going to end up. And then finally, this is really a beginning step, so don't spend too much time here. Don't dawdle. The comps is all about moving quickly through the process and not, you know, getting bogged down in the details. So selecting fields is something that you want to move through quite quickly. All right, so now you know your fields and you're trying to build a master list. I kind of imagined it like you're carving a statue, right? So start with, you know, it's much easier to go from a large pool of items and then narrow it down successively than to be stuck in the middle of the process and you're like, oh, I need to add on more readings to this. So I would start with a huge amount of items and then get that narrowed down into your final list. So that would come in two steps. The first step is building up that master list, right? Getting the slab of the statue ready. So the way I would recommend doing that is start with key texts in the field that you know through coursework, through your own experience, and just go straight to the bibliographies of those key texts and skim through the titles and kind of pick out any texts that seem relevant to your topic. The next step would be you've done your key critical texts, and those will usually be older just because of the nature of how these things are. Now find, check recent encyclopedia articles and bibliographic resources like the Oxford bibliography and things like that, and they'll often kind of list useful resources as well. And then the third step, find the most recent work, professional work, obviously, in that field. And they'll often have a long list of items that wasn't covered by the key text from earlier on. So with this way, you're getting kind of key texts and how they view the field. But you're also getting the most recent ones and any kind of newcomers added onto the field. So you're covering, you know, the established and the new oncomers. I think that should honestly be sufficient. But if you want to make your master list even bigger, you can look at available course syllabi from related courses. You can ask professors and peers, and then you can always Google and do kind of library browsing, either through online, the library catalog, or through in-person, just walking through the library. So now once you have that kind of giant slab of a master list, you have to destroy it. You have to turn it into a statue. So make a copy of it and put that copy in your archive so you feel okay kind of obliterating the list. And you want to take however many items you have there and kind of do about 30 items per field. But don't quote me on that. I think the handbook will be more specific in the number that you want and the ratio that you have there of books to articles. But so you've got that slab and now you're trying to kind of turn it into a statue and you go through successive passes, right? So on the first pass, cut out just the least relevant text. Like there are things you added on because they sound interesting, but you're not actually going to have time to read them. So take those out. And then you're left with the difficult choices, right? These are things that actually matter in that field. So on the second pass, to deal with those difficult choices, I would recommend often key authors in the field will have multiple texts, and cut out those doubles and triples. Like if they have 3 texts, cut out 2 of them. If they have 2 texts, cut out 1 of them, and spare the most recent one. Because the way these books will be written, usually the author will quote himself or herself. They'll summarize the ideas that they've already argued for in the past in their most recent work. So if you have their most recent, you're probably set. And that way you can kind of cut down on any repetitions in your list. And that's your second pass. And then your third pass, look for things that are covering 2 similar points in the field. You've already set the parameters of your field, and now you want to be representing every aspect of that field as much as you can. So it's better, I would recommend having diverse readings than having 3 texts on the same topic. And also, all things being equal, cut out the more old ones, because the more recent ones will usually summarize the older ones if they're important enough anyway. And if they're not important enough, then you don't need to know it for your comps, okay? And then again here, don't dawdle, just like in step 1. Making the reading list, it's difficult, but it's not the key component of the comp, so you don't want to be spending too much time here. All right, so now the meat of it is the reading. And what I recommend doing in this case is first start with a schedule. So you set an end date of when you want to be taking the exams, and then work backward from there. I'd recommend leaving at least 3 weeks for review prior to the exam day. and then at least 1 month per field, but preferably more if you have more time. And when you're doing this, make an educated guess of how much time each field will take. Don't be overconfident because you want the schedule to actually work, but don't be lazy as well. If you have to, 1 book a day is possible during your comps period. Like maybe not reading the full book each day, but getting the information you need from 1 book is possible, 1 per day. And when you're making the schedule, slot, like it has to be a really specific schedule. Slot every single item, every reading item into the schedule and know exactly what days you'll be reading each item. Like Dr. Roosevelt had mentioned, on the schedule of her own dissertation readings, you want to be doing something similar here. Like every day should have its item, and you should know that way ahead of time. Now, the second huge important thing here, I know both presenters talked about flexibility in scheduling, and so do that for your dissertation, but don't be flexible at all for your comps, because you have an exam day and you're trying to reach there, and if you keep adjusting your schedule, you're not going to. Just the nature of the exam date is not going to work, right? So you can absolutely not be flexible with your reading schedule. So never ever change your schedule to match your reading pace. If you're reading faster or slower, adjust your reading pace to your schedule, stick to your schedule, right? If a book has to be finished by tonight, then you finish it by any means necessary. So if that means, staying up for 3 more hours and finishing the book, then do that. If you can't do that, if it means just reading 5 minutes of the introduction, then do that and count that as complete. Like, don't feel bad if you only spend 5 minutes on this one text, because first of all, it's probably 5 minutes will likely be sufficient for the comps, the exams itself, and you can always come back after your exams to reread. So spending 5 minutes, don't feel bad about that. And second of all, you'll be preserving the integrity of the schedule that you made, right? Because once you delay your schedule for 1 book, you're opening the gate to doing it for many other books. And you just don't want to get started on that process. So finish a book by any means necessary, even if it means not giving that book its heft. You can always come back to it later. Now, when you're doing your reading and note-taking, you quickly want to get used to doing like smart skimming. So 30 minutes of highly focused reading of certain aspects of the book, like the main argument, the chapter summaries, 30 minutes of just reading those is going to be a lot more effective than spending 3 hours of just mindlessly plodding through the fluffy parts of the book, right? So we all know how academics write. Like, we've read enough and we've written enough that we know kind of behind the facade, really an argument boils down to about a page long, and everything else is either supporting evidence or doing counters and counters, and just kind of things that are useful in the highest complexity of argumentation, but that you're not going to have time for during your comps exam, right? So if you can just spend 30 minutes to get the essentials of that book, you're probably better off than getting bogged down in the details of that particular item. When you're taking notes for your reading, I would recommend restrict how many notes you have. My guess is that everyone will probably overdo rather than underperform or underdo in the comps process. So be mindful of restricting the notes you're taking. I'd recommend only taking notes on the book's introduction, especially when they're stating their core argument and when they're giving where they summarize each of the chapters of the book. And also look at each chapter's introduction and take notes on those. And then skim the rest if you have time. If you don't have time, don't even bother with the rest. Keep to your schedule. Because having more notes than those will really is not going to come into play when you're taking the actual exam. So early on, when I was taking notes, I was going way overboard. And then when I took the exam, probably 75% of things I took notes on, I just didn't have time for. And that's a kind of generous estimate. It might have been 80%, 90%. And the thing about all of this note-taking reading, ideally, we'd have a respect for this kind of knowledge, right? You're trying to become a master of the field. It's called the comprehensive exams. You want to actually be giving each reading its due. But I don't think that's a good idea for passing the exam. The exam is very specific in what it's testing you on. and you want to perform to the exam. You don't want to perform to your ideals of what it means to take knowledge. At least my whole goal with this presentation is that you pass your exam. So, so you can take anything I say with a grain of salt and fit it into your ideology of learning. But I just want you to pass the exam. So that's the advice I'm going to give in terms of reading and note taking and limiting those to just, you know, the absolute essentials. All right, so now you're kind of in that 3-week period right before your exams. You've done your readings, you've kept to your schedule, hopefully, and you're getting ready to take for the exams. So 3 weeks of review time, I would divide that into 1 week per field. And then start by arranging your readings into a coherent order. You know, just list their titles maybe, don't get bogged down in the notes, but know kind of where titles will fit into a general argument or a general framework of this knowledge. And if you know the question ahead of time, then you can arrange this order accordingly. If you don't, then just make it a coherent, logical order. And now you've got your readings kind of slightly organized, at least by title, and you've got your notes. How do you turn this into being ready for the exam? That's where you have to consider what I'm terming the comps quandary, which is recognizing the 2 limits during the comps exam, which is the limit of time. You have very limited time. I think it's 5 hours per exam. And the limit of memory, right? Where most of us are not memory masters. Omar is a hafiz, mashallah, but most of us will have more difficulty memorizing things verbatim. So you have to recognize that limitation when you're preparing. So let's look at time first. So the limit of time, you have 5 hours per field. Set aside 1 hour for like outlining, thinking on the question, especially if it's the first time you saw the question. So that gives you 4 hours, right? Let's say you have 30 items per field. So that's about 8 minutes per item, right? And this is, you know, again, I'm simplifying things, like different items will have different weights in terms of what's more important to talk about. If we're just taking averages, simplifying, that's about 8 minutes per item. Now, a peak typing speed is 40 words per minute, and that's a max of 320 words per item if you take 8 minutes at 40 words per minute. But that's if you're typing like a crazy fast. Like that's if you're, you know, you have a transcript in front of you and you're just typing it. For anyone else, you know, who's thinking and who's kind of like a normal human being in terms of typing, they're going to hit about 160 words per item, you know, if you're following that 8 minutes per item. So 160 words is about how much space you're going to have, how much time you're going to have to fit that item within the exam, right? So compare how many notes that you took, pages and pages of notes, and then how many words you can actually fit. It's about 160 words, like a paragraph. So that's one consideration to keep in mind. And then the second limitation is your memory. So even if you're a pro typer and you can do the 40 words per minute, you know, mode, you probably can't remember details for 90 plus items, right? Because the exams are all happening back to back. So you have to digest things into very memorable short items, right? So for dealing with these 2 limitations, you go through this distillation process, right? So you won't have the time or the mental capacity to reproduce all those notes you took. So you have to distill them down to manageable form. So stage 1 in that is you boil each item's notes down to about 1 short paragraph. It can be medium length if it has to, but a short paragraph is much better. And that's all you've had time for, right? Like we explained with the quandary. Now, stage 2, once you have that paragraph, like save that paragraph, make sure it's saved somewhere. Distill that paragraph down to key phrases, like 3-4 word phrases that you can memorize, right? So that's what stage 3 is going to be. You're memorizing the key phrases for each item. And I would literally I would have the title memorized, and then I would of that book or article, and then I'd know the 3 key phrases, and I just walk around, you know, okay, there was this book and it had these phrases, there was this book and it had these 3 phrases, and then you kind of know the core arguments of each book. And it sounds kind of simplistic, like what's, you know, 3 phrases per book sounds really easy, but when you do that for like 90 items, you can kind of start to appreciate having shorter things rather than longer things to memorize. So now you've got memorized phrases and you've got paragraphs, and review those 2 in tandem with each other. Like when you're memorizing the key phrases, reread the paragraph of that book. That way, on the day of the exam, you know, you just jot down the key phrases and you know what the paragraph's trajectory was. You don't know the paragraph verbatim, but you know, you've kind of triggered the memory of the core arguments going on there. And then you'll be prepared for being able to like reproduce the core arguments of each item and kind of do cross-textual analysis on the day of the exam. So during the exam, when you're taking it, again, the time problem, you have to forget about spelling, about anything but basic grammar, and forget artistic language. You want to be getting the core arguments on the page, right? You spend so much time reading these things. That's what you want to prove on the day of the comps. So don't even consider diacritics. There's some people in their text messages, even they're diacriticizing their writing. Don't worry about that at all. I know Professor Brown is in courses, he's a stickler for it out of the faculty. But on the comps, I think he kind of drops that standard. Because the exams, they're not about testing your writing ability or your your kind of eloquence or your reviewing, editing ability. It's about testing your mastery of the text on the reading list, right? So spend more time figuring out comprehensible, like basically comprehensible. That's it. That's all you need. Cross-textual arguments, connecting different items with each other. That's much more important than a well-written, eloquent prose. Okay, so you just think about what the comps is testing for, and you reproduce that. You give them, what they're asking for. And then finally, I left out language exams. I just have 2 pieces of advice there. So don't dawdle on language exams. They can kind of distract you from the actual meat of the comps. Just get them done as soon as you can and get by them. And then as a secret AIS strategy, in my experience, the French exam is much easier than the German exam. So if you're at the level where you haven't picked yet and you want the easiest, I know French, in our department at least, the way it's tested is less strict than the way German is tested. So I took French and I had friends who took German, and they had to work much harder for their exam. And that's everything. So thank you
very much, Ali, for this really detailed and very helpful tips. And thank you very much, everyone, for your presentations. And now we can hear Karen McNair. Let me first introduce you to you. So Karen McNair is a PhD candidate whose research interests include Arabic social linguistics, Tunisian Arabic, and literary translation. Her main interest is the changing status of the spoken vernaculars in the Arab world. She is currently writing her dissertation on the development of Tunisian Arabic as a written language. Her dissertation focuses on the spelling and code switching choices that Tunisians make when writing a yet-to-be standardized language, and what these reveal about collective and individual identity stances. In this work, Karen is making use of the Tunisian Arabic corpus that she has been developing since 2011. And now she will be presenting us about project management skills. So please join me in welcoming her.
Hello, thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you all see the presentation? Okay, so today I'm going to talk about project management kind of as a generic process. So I'm going to be using the example of preparing for comps or writing a dissertation, but really this is a kind of process that can work with any kind of project. If you're planning a wedding, if you're planning writing an article, all these sort of things, like projects big and small can benefit from being managed. And I kind of laugh about this in graduate school because it's really ironic, because in no other field of work would you have like someone planning to do a project like a dissertation that's going to take, years, and have like not a really super detailed plan of what you're going to do by when. And we don't really do this in academia, and they definitely don't teach us how to do this as graduate students. So I'm going to be kind of going through what like in a normal business or field people would do. So your first step is determining your deadline and budget. So this is a really big one, and it's one that I don't think a lot of people do, is deciding when you need to have your dissertation finished by, and deciding this before you start it. So this can be determined by, you want to be on the job market for such and such academic year. So that means you have to defend by this date, which means you need to have your completed draft by this date. You know, just really figuring that out is very important. So for instance, you know, like if you want to be on the job market for, you know, if you want to start working and like earning actual money in, you know, fall of 2024, you know, figuring out, okay, that means I need to defend my dissertation before I start working, and I need to have a defense date when I'm applying for jobs the previous fall. So that means, you know, giving the specific time, which is in the grad handbook, for, you know, how long you need to have for the defense and for the readers and everything like that, and coming with a very specific date. Okay, that means I need to have my completed draft to my supervisor by this date, and then sticking to that. And by budget here, like you might have an actual budget if you need to travel for your research and, you know, grants and everything, but probably what it's going to be more is your time budget. So, okay, if you have, you know, 18 months that you're going to be working on your dissertation, how many hours a day are you really realistically going to have to work? So how many total hours are you going to have to work on your dissertation? So I think a lot of people skip this step and they kind of go into it with a mentality of, well, I don't know how long it's going to take, so it'll just take however long it takes. But I would really caution you against going in with that mentality, because it's like trying to plan a wedding and saying it'll cost however much it costs. You're going to end up with a wedding that costs a ton. Like you have to have some kind of limits, or else things just expand to fill everything. Okay, so after you've, you know, determined your deadline and how long you have, then you go to determining what your project's major steps are. So Ali covered this really well for comps, so I'll skip that part. But for your dissertation, this would be like, you know, doing your literature review, developing your proposal, data collection, data analysis, and then specific writing by chapters. And I put these like in linear order like this, but you don't necessarily actually want to do them that way. It's probably best if you're doing multiple things at once. And especially if you're writing continuously throughout the entire process. This will make your life so much easier. It'll make it so much more efficient, because a lot of people kind of plan it where they do all the research for their dissertation, you know, taking however many months, and then plan however many months where they're going to, you know, take that knowledge and then write their dissertation. And the problem with that is that, first of all, your reading and research can just extend for a really long time, because it's really easy to always find, you know, one more thing to read. And it's really hard to start writing when you haven't done any writing. And also you're going to read a lot of things that you're going to end up not actually needing for your dissertation. So I made this mistake with my comps where I was starting out just taking notes on the readings, and, you know, I tried to limit the notes I was taking, but I was still taking a lot of notes for each reading. And then at some point I kind of ran out of the time I had for reading. And so I like told myself, okay, I need to just start working on the practice essays. And then whatever I haven't read that I think I really need for those essays, I'll read them while I'm writing the essays. And I wish that I had done that from the beginning, you know, having my practice essays, or, you know, in two of my fields, I actually had the questions ahead of time. And if I had started out, you know, just taking what's in my head and writing a crappy draft of an answer to that question, and then going through my readings, and with every reading, instead of taking extensive notes on it, just adding it to that writing, like, you know, just extracting that one piece of you know, main point or whatever that's important for that topic, like it would have been a lot more efficient, and I would have wasted a lot less time. And I did that a little bit also with my literature review. I at the beginning, I was reading too much because I was trying to read first and then write. And then when I started actually writing my literature review and only going back to the readings for things that I was going to put directly in it, it was a lot more efficient that way. And another reason that that's a really good idea is because then if you're writing a little bit all along, then the starting writing doesn't become this like huge, scary monster. You're never facing a blank page because you've got all these snippets and things that you're just throwing in there. Okay, so after you've got your major steps, what you want to do is break all of those major steps into smaller steps. And the smaller you can make the steps, the better, because every time you can have a step that you can, get an easy win and check off, it's just really motivating and it keeps you going and everything. And this is a good thing to do while you're writing the proposal. Our department doesn't actually require like a long 3-chapter proposal, but I actually did that, and I recommend to everyone to do that because I think it sets you up very well for actually completing the dissertation. And one of the reasons why is because when you're writing, the proposal with the literature review and the methods and everything, you're really thinking in depth about every step of your project. So you're kind of picturing it and you're imagining, okay, well, when I finish doing that, what do I do next? And then what do I need to do that? Okay, so I need to go back. And while you're doing that, you can be making these smaller steps so that by the time you're done with your proposal, you really kind of have a very clear roadmap for your project. And then also, like Annie said, if you can make some of these steps like concrete deliverables, that's really good. So conference submissions, journal papers, chapters to your advisor, that's really helpful. And especially for the conference submission and journal papers, because as Annie and Rosabelle kind of alluded to, like once your dissertation's done, no one's going to read it. Like your committee will hopefully read it, but even like some members on your committee might only skim a lot of it. Like really, when you're on the job market, they're going to care about your publications. Like number one thing, your grants that you've gotten, your conferences that you presented at. They're going to care that your dissertation is done, but they're not going to read it. So so just kind of nipping that perfectionism in the bud and thinking about the things that you're going to get out of your dissertation that are actually going to be helpful to you on the job market. Okay, so once you've got all of your small steps, then you compute like how much time you need to take to like do each step, and then using how many hours a week you have to work, that gives you like actual how many days or weeks is this step going to take. So this is really kind of where the rubber meets the road. To do this, you obviously need to know two things. You need to know how many hours a week you have to work on the project and about how long it takes you to do things. The second one is tricky. What I really highly recommend, this is something I've done for a few years now, is tracking your time. I use this thing called Toggle Track, and I track everything I do when I'm working on something. So I can actually go back and look, okay, this paper that is being published, what is the total amount of time that I spent on this paper? And it's usually way more than I would have guessed that it was. So when you're doing these time estimates, really kind of do them generously and figure on more time than you think it should take, because it'll still probably even take longer than that. Everything always takes longer than what you think they should take. So like for instance, for my chapter writings, I had estimated, that a chapter should take about 40 hours. That was something I read in a book, that was about dissertations. But for most of my chapters, I actually gave myself 100 hours to do it, because the last paper I did was a total 100 hours. I don't think these will actually take that long, but when I allot that much time for them, that gives me a buffer that I can then use for if something else takes longer than it should. So you have this planned out, and then once you do this, you may find that after you plan out how long everything's going to take, it puts you past the deadline that you decide you need to have. So this is really kind of expected because most of us start out with projects that are way bigger than what they should be. So when you come to that point, you can, deal with it two ways. One is to adjust your deadline, but this is a really, really bad idea, because if you're going on the academic job market, if you adjust your deadline, that could mean that you lose an entire year and have to wait for the next cycle. And then also it's difficult to realize whether you're in graduate school, but being in graduate school is actually very expensive. Like there's a huge opportunity cost. So the sooner you can get your dissertation done, the better off you will be. So the second option and the better option is to adjust the scope of your project. Look at it and say, okay, what is everything I'm doing? And do I really need to be doing all of this? And then, and you can do this in consultation with your advisor, if your advisor is kind of helpful in that way. A really good tool that is useful and that I use a lot is something called a Gantt chart. And so I have these dates here, but like I basically put them down to kind of help me thinking as I was making this chart. And what I really use on a day-to-day basis is this graphing that shows, for every week, what am I working on that week? And you can actually see that right now I'm actually a couple weeks behind because a couple of things happened that were unexpected. But because I have some buffer built in and everything, like I think I'll still be okay. So when you're doing this planning, you're planning out the time. It's really important to block out vacation. And it's important when you're calculating how many hours a week, don't include weekends. Like actually set yourself up for a reasonable, sustainable working system because a project like a dissertation, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. You don't want to start out trying to go all out. And then also that gives you a buffer where if you do get a little behind, and you can work a little bit on the weekend to catch up. But yeah, so I have this Gantt chart that's for the entire project. Let's see if I can show it here. So this goes like the entire time period that I'm expecting to be working on it, all the way down to submitting the dissertation and defense and everything like that. But I actually don't look at this all at once. I have a printout that is just this semester, and I actually like color it in with pens when I finish something. It's very satisfying. Like I have like colored Sharpies, like just for this purpose. And so like I can start like every week, I know what I'm working on. And this is great because it really helps in doing that, working on multiple things at a time. So this is something that's kind of happening in the background. This is like the coding that I'm doing actively. And then while I'm doing that, I'm also doing writing. And I think this is very useful because, okay, if I have 5 hours a day to work, I can't actually write for 5 hours in a productive way. Like I can only write like good text for maybe 2 or 3 hours. So maybe I do a couple hours of writing in the morning, and then in the later part of the morning, I do data analysis or something like that. And this really makes it easy to do multiple things at once like that. And the last thing I'll say is just with this, like I said, when you are doing all this, and it's helpful to do it while you're making your proposal. And so this is the proposal that I did. And I included a first page on here, which is not a required part of the proposal, but really, really should be, which is project deliverables and timelines. Like decide for yourself and, make a contract with your supervisor. This is when I'm going to get everything done. These are the steps along the way. And that gives you kind of clear, breaking it up into small chunks and also keeping you moving as the project goes forward. And I think that is everything. So
thank you very much, Karen. That was really helpful.